Hello, and welcome back to Baby Alice's Stories. We now return to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Chapter 15. A Walk on the Bottom of the Sea. This cell was, to speak correctly, the arsenal and wardrobe of the Nautilus. A dozen diving apparatuses hung from the partition waiting our use. Ned Land, on seeing them, showed evident repugnance to dress himself in one. "But my worthy Ned, the forests of the island of Crespo are nothing but submarine forests." "Good," said the disappointed harpooner, who saw his dreams of fresh meat fade away. "And you, Monsieur Aeronaut, are you going to dress yourself in those clothes?" "There is no alternative, Master Ned." "As you please, sir," replied the harpooner, shrugging his shoulders. "But as for me, unless I am forced, I will never get into one." "No one will force you, Master Ned," said Captain Nemo. "Is Conseil going to risk it?" asked Ned. "I follow my master wherever he goes," replied Conseil. At the captain's call, 2 of the ship's crew came to help us dress in these heavy and impervious clothes, made of India rubber without seam and constructed expressly to resist considerable pressure. One would have thought it a suit of armor, but both supple and resisting. This suit formed trousers and waistcoat. The trousers were finished off with thick boots, weighted with heavy laden soles. The texture of the waistcoat was held together by bands of copper, which crossed the chest, protecting it from the great pressure of the water, and leaving the lungs free to act. The sleeves ended in gloves, which in no way restrained the movement of the hands. There was a vast difference noticeable between these consummate apparatuses and the old cork breastplates, jackets, and other contrivances in vogue during the 18th century. Captain Nemo and one of his companions, a sort of Hercules who must have possessed great strength, Conseil and myself were soon enveloped in the dresses. There remained nothing more to be done but to enclose our heads in the metal box. But before proceeding to this operation, I asked the captain's permission to examine the guns. One of the Nautilus men gave me a simple gun, the butt end of which, made of steel, hollow in the center, was rather large. It served as a reservoir for compressed air, which a valve, worked by a spring, allowed to escape into a metal tube. A box of projectiles in a groove in the thickness of the butt end contained about 20 of these electric balls, which, by means of a spring, were forced into the barrel of the gun. As soon as one shot was fired, another was ready. "Captain Nemo," said I, "this arm is perfect and easily handled. I only ask to be allowed to try it. But how shall we gain the bottom of the sea?" "At this moment, Professor, the Nautilus is stranded in 5 fathoms, and we have nothing to do but to start." "But how shall we get off?" "You shall see." Captain Nemo thrust his head into the helmet. Conseil and I did the same, not without hearing an ironical good sport from the Canadian. The under part of our dress terminated in a copper collar upon which was screwed the metal helmet. 3 holes, protected by thick glass, allowed us to see in all directions by simple turning our head in the interior of the headdress as soon as it was in position. The quay roll apparatus on our backs began to act, and for my part, I could breathe with ease. With the Ruhmkorff lamp hanging from my belt and the gun in my hand, I was ready to set out. But to speak the truth, imprisoned in these heavy garments and glued to the deck by my leaden soles, it was impossible for me to take a step. But this state of things was provided for. I felt myself being pushed into a little room contiguous to the wardrobe room. Contiguous, sharing a common border, touching, adjacent. I felt myself being pushed into a little room contiguous to the wardrobe room. My companions followed, towed along in the same way. I heard a watertight door, furnished with stopper plates, close upon us, and we were wrapped in profound darkness. After some minutes, a loud hissing was heard. I felt the cold mount from my feet to my chest. Evidently, from some part of the vessel they had, by means of a tap, given entrance to the water, which was invading us, and with which the room was soon filled. A second door cut in the side of the Nautilus, then opened. We saw a faint light. In another instant, our feet trod the bottom of the sea. And now, how can I retrace the impression left upon me by that walk under the waters? Words are impotent to relate such wonders. Captain Nemo walked in front. His companion followed some steps behind. Conseil and I remained near each other, as if an exchange of words had been possible through our metallic cases. I no longer felt the weight of my clothing, or of my shoes, of my reservoir of air, or my thick helmet, in the midst of which my head rattled like an almond in its shell. The light which lit the soil 30 feet below the surface of the ocean astonished me by its power. The solar rays shone through the watery mass easily and dissipated all color, and I clearly distinguished objects at a distance of 150 yards. Beyond that, the tints darkened into fine gradations of ultramarine and faded into vague obscurity. Truly, this water which surrounded me was but another air, denser than the terrestrial atmosphere, but almost as transparent. Above me was the calm surface of the sea. We were walking on fine, even sand, not wrinkled as on a flat shore, which retains the impressions of the billows. This dazzling carpet, really a reflector, repelled the rays of the sun with wonderful intensity, which accounted for the vibration which penetrated every atom of liquid. Shall I believe when I say that at the depth of 30 feet, I could see as if I was in broad daylight? For a quarter of an hour, I trod on this sand, sown with the impalpable dust of shells. The hull of the Nautilus, resembling a long shoal, disappeared by degrees, but its lantern, when darkness should overtake us in the waters, would help to guide us on board by its distinct rays. Soon forms of objects outlined in the distance were discernible. I recognized magnificent rocks hung with a tapestry of zoophytes of the most beautiful kind, and I was at first struck by the peculiar effect of this medium. It was then 10 in the morning. The rays of the sun struck the surface of the waves at rather an oblique angle, and at the touch of their light, decomposed by refraction as through a prism, flowers, rocks, plants, shells, and poulpi were shaded at the edges by the 7 solar colors. It was marvelous, a feast for the eyes, this complication of colored tints, a perfect kaleidoscope of green, yellow, orange, violet, indigo, and blue. In one word, the whole palette of an enthusiastic colorist. Why could I not communicate to Conseil the lively sensations which were mounting to my brain, and rival him in expression of admiration? For aught I knew, Captain Nemo and his companion might be able to exchange thoughts by means of signs previously agreed upon. So, for want of better, I talked to myself. I declaimed in the copper box which covered my head, thereby expending more air in vain words than was perhaps wise. Various kinds of ices, clusters of pure toughed coral, prickly fungi, and anemones formed a brilliant garden of flowers, decked with their collarets of blue tentacles, sea stars studding the sandy bottom. It was a real grief to me to crush under my feet the brilliant specimens of mollusk, which strewed the ground by thousands of hammerheads, donaceae, vertebral bounding shells, of staircases and red helmet shells, angel wings, and many others produced by this inexhaustible ocean. But we were bound to walk, so we went on, whilst above our heads waved medusae, whose umbrellas of opal or rose pink, escalloped with a band of blue, sheltered us from the rays of the sun, and fiery pelagiae, which in the darkness would have strewn our path with phosphorescent light. All these wonders I saw in the space of a quarter of a mile, scarcely stopping and following Captain Nemo, who beckoned me on by signs. Soon the nature of the soil changed. To the sandy plain succeeded an extent of slimy mud which the Americans call ooze, composed of equal parts of siliceous and calcareous shells.
Calcareous.
Calcareous, containing calcium carbonate, chalky, composed of equal parts of siliceous and calcareous shells. We then traveled over a plain of seaweed of wild and luxuriant vegetation. This sward was of close texture and soft to the feet, and rivaled the softest carpet woven by the hand of man. But whilst verdure was spread at our feet, it did not abandon our heads. A light network of marine plants, of that inexhaustible family of seaweeds, of which more than 2,000 kinds are known, grew on the surface of the water. I noticed that the green plants kept nearer the top of the sea, whilst the red were at a greater depth. leaving to the black or brown the care of forming gardens and parterres in the remote beds of the ocean. We had quitted the Nautilus about an hour and a half. It was noon. I knew by the perpendicularity of the sun's rays, which were no longer refracted, the magical colors disappeared by degrees, and the shades of emerald and sapphire were effaced. We walked with a regular step, which rang upon the ground with astonishing intensity. The slightest noise was transmitted with a quickness to which the ear is unaccustomed on the earth. Indeed, water is a better conductor of sound than air, in the ratio of 4:1. At this period, the earth sloped downwards. The light took a uniform tint. We were at a depth of 105 yards and 20 inches, undergoing a pressure of 6 atmospheres. At this depth, I could still see the rays of the sun, though feebly. To their intense brilliancy had succeeded a reddish twilight, the lowest state between day and night. But we could still see well enough. It was not necessary to resort to the Ruhmkorff apparatus as yet. At this moment, Captain Nemo stopped. He waited till I joined him, and then pointed to an obscure mass, looming in the shadow at a short distance. "It is the forest of the island of Crespo," thought I, and I was not mistaken. Chapter 16. A Submarine Forest. We had at last arrived on the borders of this forest, doubtless one of the finest of Captain Nemo's immense domains. He looked upon it as his own, and considered he had the same right over it that the first men had in the first days of the world. And indeed, who would have disputed with him the possession of this submarine property? What other hardier pioneer would come, hatchet in hand, to cut down the dark copses? This forest was composed of large tree plants, and the moment we penetrated under its vast arcades, I was struck by the singular position of their branches, a position I had not yet observed. Not an herb which carpeted the ground, not a branch which clothed the trees was either broken or bent, nor did they extend horizontally. All stretched up to the surface of the ocean, not a filament, not a ribbon, however thin they might be, but kept as straight as a rod of iron. The fuci and Ilianas grew in rigid, perpendicular lines, due to the density of the element which had produced them. Motionless, yet, when bent to one side by the hand, they directly resumed their former position. Truly, it was the region of perpendicularity. I soon accustomed myself to this fantastic position, as well as to the comparative darkness which surrounded us. The soil of the forest seemed covered with sharp blocks, difficult to avoid. The submarine flora struck me as being very perfect, and richer even than it would have been in the Arctic or tropical zones, where these productions are not so plentiful. But for some minutes I involuntarily confounded the genera, taking animals for plants, and who would not have been mistaken? The fauna and the flora are too closely allied in this submarine world. These plants are self-propagated, and the principle of their existence is in the water, which upholds and nourishes them. The greater number, instead of leaves, shoot forth blades of capricious shapes, comprised within a scale of colors pink, carmine, green, olive, fawn, and brown. Curious anomaly, fantastic element, said an ingenious naturalist, in which the animal kingdom blossoms and the vegetable does not. In about an hour, Captain Nemo gave the signal to halt. I, for my part, was not sorry, and we stretched ourselves under an arbor of alariae. Alari, the long thin blades of which stood up like arrows. This short rest seemed delicious to me. There was nothing wanting but the charm of conversation, but impossible to speak, impossible to answer. I only put my great copperhead to Conseil's. I saw the worthy fellow's eyes glistening with delight, and to show his satisfaction, he shook himself in his breastplate of air in the most comical way in the world. After 4 hours of this walking, I was surprised not to find myself dreadfully hungry. How to account for this state of the stomach I could not tell, but instead I felt an insurmountable desire to sleep, which happens to all divers, and my eyes soon closed behind the thick glasses, and I fell into a heavy slumber, which the movement alone had prevented before. Captain Nemo and his robust companion, stretched in their clear crystal, set us the example. How long I remained buried in this drowsiness I cannot judge, but when I woke the sun seemed sinking towards the horizon. Captain Nemo had already risen, and I was beginning to stretch my limbs, when an unexpected apparition brought me briskly to my feet. A few steps off, a monstrous sea spider, about 38 inches high, was watching me with squinting eyes, ready to spring upon me. Though my diver's dress was thick enough to defend me from the bite of this animal, I could not help shuddering with horror. Conseil and the sailor of the Nautilus awoke at this moment. Captain Nemo pointed out the hideous crustacean, which a blow from the butt end of the gun knocked over, and I saw the horrible claws of the monster writhe in terrible convulsions. This incident reminded me that other animals more to be feared might haunt these obscure depths, against whose attacks my diving dress would not protect me. I had never thought of it before, but I now resolved to be upon my guard. Indeed, I thought that this halt would mark the termination of our walk, but I was mistaken. For instead of returning to the Nautilus, Captain Nemo continued his bold excursion. The ground was still on the incline. Its declivity seemed to be getting greater, and to be leading us to greater depths. It must have been about 3 o'clock when we reached a narrow valley between high perpendicular walls, situated about 75 fathoms deep. Thanks to the perfection of our apparatus, we were 45 fathoms below the limit which nature seemed to have imposed on man as to his submarine excursions. I say 75 fathoms, though I had no instrument by which to judge the distance. But I knew that even in the clearest waters, the solar rays could not penetrate further, and accordingly the darkness deepened. At 10 paces, not an object was visible. I was groping my way when I suddenly saw a brilliant white light. Captain Nemo had just put his electric apparatus into use. His companion did the same, and Conseil and I followed their example. By turning a screw, I established a communication between the wire and the spiral glass, and the sea, lit by our 4 lanterns, was illuminated for a circle of 36 yards. As we walked, I thought the light of our Rumpkorf apparatus could not fail to draw some inhabitant from its dark couch. But if they did approach us, they at least kept at a respectful distance from the hunters. Several times I saw Captain Nemo stop, put his gun to his shoulder, and after some moments drop it and walk on. At last, after about 4 hours, this marvelous excursion came to an end. A wall of superb rocks, in an imposing mass, rose before us, a heap of gigantic blocks, an enormous, steep granite shore forming dark grottos, but which presented no practicable slope. It was the prop of the island of Crespo. It was the earth. Captain Nemo stopped suddenly. A gesture of his brought us all to a halt, and however desirous I might be to scale the wall, I was obliged to stop. Here ended Captain Nemo's domains, and he would not go beyond them. Further on was a portion of the globe he might not trample upon. The return began. Captain Nemo had returned to the head of his little band, directing their course without hesitation. I thought we were not following the same road to return to the Nautilus. The new road was very steep and consequently very painful. We approached the surface of the sea rapidly, but this return to the upper strata was not so sudden as to cause relief from the pressure too rapidly, which might have produced serious disorder in our organization and brought on internal lesions so fatal to divers. Very soon light reappeared and grew, and the sun being low on the horizon, the refraction edged the different objects with a spectral ring. At 10 yards and half deep, we walked amidst a shoal of little fishes of all kinds, more numerous than the birds of the air, and also more agile. But no aquatic game worthy of a shot had as yet met our gaze. When at that moment I saw the captain shoulder his gun quickly and follow a moving object into the shrubs. He fired. I heard a slight hissing, and the creature fell stunned at some distance from us. It was a magnificent sea otter, an enhydrus, the only exclusively marine quadruped. This otter was 5 feet long and must have been very valuable. Its skin, chestnut brown above and silvery underneath, would have made one of those beautiful furs so sought after in the Russian and Chinese markets. The finesse and the luster of its coat would certainly fetch 80 British pounds sterling. I admired this curious mammal, with its rounded head ornamented with short ears, its round eyes and white whiskers like those of a cat, with webbed feet and nails and tufted tail. This precious animal, hunted and tracked by fishermen, has now become very rare and taken refuge chiefly in the northern parts of the Pacific, or probably its race would soon become extinct. Captain Nemo's companion took the beast, threw it over his shoulder, and we continued our journey. For 1 hour a plain of sand lay stretched before us. Sometimes it rose to within 2 yards and some inches of the surface of the water. I then saw our image clearly reflected, drawn inversely, and above us appeared an identical group reflecting our movements and our actions. In a word, like us in every point, except that they walked with their heads downward and their feet in the air. Another effect I noticed, which was the passage of thick clouds, which formed and vanished rapidly. But on reflection, I understood that these seeming clouds were due to the varying thickness of the reeds at the bottom, and I could even see the fleecy foam which their broken tops multiplied on the water, and the shadows of large birds passing above our heads, whose rapid flight I could discern on the surface of the sea. On this occasion I was witness to one of the finest gunshots which ever made the nerves of a hunter thrill. A large bird of great breadth of wing, clearly visible, approached, hovering over us. Captain Nemo's companion shouldered his gun and fired. When it was only a few yards above the waves, the creature fell stunned, and the force of its fall brought it within reach of dexterous hunter's grasp. It was an albatross of the finest kind. Our march had not been interrupted by this incident. For 2 hours we followed these sandy plains, then fields of algae very disagreeable to cross. Candidly, I could do no more when I saw a glimmer of light, which, for a half-mile, broke the darkness of the waters. It was the lantern of the Nautilus. Before 20 minutes were over, we should be on board, and I should be able to breathe with ease, for it seemed that my reservoir supplied air very deficient in oxygen. But I did not reckon on an accidental meeting which delayed our arrival for some time. I had remained some steps behind when I presently saw Captain Nemo coming hurriedly towards me. With his strong hand he bent me to the ground, his companion doing the same to Conseil. At first I knew not what to think of this sudden attack, but I was soon reassured by seeing that the captain lie down beside me and remain immovable. I was stretched on the ground, just under the shelter of a bush of algae, when raising my head I saw some enormous mass casting phosphorescent gleams pass blusteringly by. My blood froze in my veins as I recognized 2 formidable sharks which threatened us. It was a couple of Tintorias, terrible creatures, with enormous tails and a dull glassy stare. The phosphorescent matter ejected from holes pierced around the muzzle. Monstrous brutes, which would crush a whole man in their iron jaws. I did not know whether Conseil stopped to classify them. For my part, I noticed their silver bellies and their huge mouths bristling with teeth from a very unscientific point of view, and more as a possible victim than as a naturalist. Happily, the voracious creatures did not see well. They passed without seeing us, brushing us with their brownish fins, and we escaped by a miracle from a danger certainly greater than meeting a tiger full face in the forest. Half an hour after, guided by the electric light, we reached the Nautilus. The outside door had been left open, and Captain Nemo closed it as soon as we had entered the first cell. He then pressed a knob. I heard the pumps working in the midst of the vessel. I felt the water sinking from around me, and in a few moments the cell was entirely empty. The inside door then opened, and we entered the vestry. There our diving dress was taken off, not without some trouble, and fairly worn out from want of food and sleep, I returned to my room, in great wonder at this surprising excursion at the bottom of the sea. Chapter 17. 4,000 Leagues Under the Pacific. The next morning, the 18th of November, I had quite recovered from my fatigues of the day before, and I went up onto the platform just as the second lieutenant was uttering his daily phrase. I was admiring the magnificent aspect of the ocean when Captain Nemo appeared. He did not seem to be aware of my presence, and began a series of astronomical observations. Then, when he had finished, he went and leaned on the cage of the watchlight and gazed abstractedly on the ocean. In the meantime, a number of the sailors of the Nautilus, all strong and healthy men, had come up onto the platform. They came to draw up the nets that had been laid all night. These sailors were evidently of different nations, although the European type was visible in all of them. I recognized some unmistakable Irishmen, Frenchmen, some Slavs, and a Greek or a Candiote. They were civil, and only used that odd language among themselves, the origin of which I could not guess, neither could I question them. The nets were hauled in. They were a large kind of chaluts, like those on the Normandy coasts, great buckets that the waves had a chain fixed in the smaller meshes kept open. These buckets, drawn by iron poles, swept through the water and gathered in everything in their way. That day, they brought up curious specimens from those productive coasts. I reckoned that the haul had brought in more than 900 weight of fish. It was a fine haul, but not to be wondered at. Indeed, the nets are let down for several hours and enclose in their meshes an infinite variety. We had no lack of excellent food, and the rapidity of the Nautilus and the attraction of the electric light could always renew our supply. These several productions of the sea were immediately lowered through the panel to the steward's room, some to be eaten fresh and others pickled. The fishing ended and the provision of air renewed. I thought that the Nautilus was about to continue its submarine excursion and was preparing to return to my room, when without further preamble the captain turned to me saying, "Professor, is not this ocean gifted with real life? It has its tempers and its gentle moods. Yesterday it slept as we did, and now it has woke after a quiet night. Look," he continued, "it wakes under the caresses of the sun. It is going to renew its diurnal existence."
Diurnal.
Diurnal of, or during the day, daily of each day, diurnal, daily. It is going to renew its diurnal existence. It is an interesting study to watch the play of its organization. It has a pulse, arteries, spasms, and I agree with the learned Maori, who discovered in it a circulation as real as the circulation of blood in animals. Yes, the ocean has indeed circulation, and to promote it, the Creator has caused things to multiply in it. Caloric, salt, and animalculae. Animalculae. When Captain Nemo spoke thus, he seemed altogether changed and aroused an extraordinary emotion in me. Also, he added, true existence is there, and I can imagine the foundations of nautical towns, clusters of submarine houses, which, like the Nautilus, would ascend every morning to breathe at the surface of the water. Free towns, independent cities. Yet who knows whether some despot. Captain Nemo finished his sentence with a violent gesture. Then, addressing me as if to chase away some sorrowful thought, "Monsieur Aronnaud," he asked, Do you know the depth of the ocean? I only know, Captain, what the principal soundings have taught us. Could you tell me them so that I can suit them to my purpose? There are some, I replied, that I remember. If I am not mistaken, a depth of 8,000 yards has been found in the North Atlantic, and 2,500 yards in the Mediterranean. The most remarkable soundings have been made in the South Atlantic near the 35th parallel, and they gave 12,000 yards, 14,000 yards, and 15,000 yards. To sum up all, it is reckoned that if the bottom of the sea were leveled, its mean depth would be about 1¾ leagues. Well, Professor, replied the captain, we shall show you better than that, I hope. As to the mean depth of this part of the Pacific, I tell you it is only 4,000 yards. Having said this, Captain Nemo went towards the panel and disappeared down the ladder. I followed him and went into the large drawing room. The screw was immediately put in motion and the log gave 20 miles an hour. During the days and weeks that passed, Captain Nemo was very sparing of his visits. I seldom saw him. The lieutenant picked the ship's course regularly on the chart, so I could always tell exactly the route of the Nautilus. Nearly every day for some time, the panels of the drawing room were opened, and we were never tired of penetrating the mysteries of the submarine world. The general direction of the Nautilus was southeast. It kept between 100 and 150 yards of depth. One day, however, I do not know why, being drawn diagonally by means of the inclined planes, it touched the bed of the sea. The thermometer indicated a temperature of 4.25 degrees centigrade, a temperature that at this depth seemed common to all latitudes. At 3 o'clock in the morning of the 26th of November, the Nautilus crossed the Tropic of Cancer at 172 degrees longitude. On the 27th instant, it sighted the Sandwich Islands, where Cook died, February 14, 1779. We had then gone 4,860 leagues from our starting point. In the morning, when I went on the platform, I saw 2 miles to windward Hawaii, the largest of the 7 islands that form the group. I saw clearly the cultivated ranges and the several mountain chains that run parallel with the side, and the volcanoes that overtop Mauna Ria, which rise 5,000 yards above the level of the sea. Besides other things the nets brought up were several flabellariae. Flabellari were several flabellariae and graceful polypi that are peculiar to that part of the ocean. The direction of the Nautilus was still to the southeast. It crossed the equator December 1st in 142 degrees longitude, and on the 4th of the same month, after crossing rapidly and without anything in particular occurring, we sighted the Marquesas group. I saw 3 miles off Martin's Peak and Noukahiva, the largest of the group that belongs to France. I only saw the woody mountains against the horizon because Captain Nemo did not wish to bring the ship to the wind. There the nets brought up beautiful specimens of fish, some with azure fins and tails like gold, the flesh of which is unrivaled, some nearly destitute of scales, but of exquisite flavor. others with bony jaws and yellow-tinged gills as good as bonitos, all fish that would be of use to us. After leaving these charming islands protected by the French flag, from the 4th to the 11th of December, the Nautilus sailed over about 2,000 miles. During the daytime of the 11th of December, I was busy reading in the large drawing room. Ned Land and Conseil watched the luminous water through the half-open panels. The Nautilus was immovable. While its reservoirs were filled, it kept at a depth of 1,000 yards, a region rarely visited in the ocean, and in which large fish were seldom seen. I was then reading a charming book by Jean Masse, The Slaves of the Stomach, and I was learning some valuable lessons from it when Conseil interrupted me. "Will master come here a moment?" he said in a curious voice. "What is the matter, Conseil?" "I want master to look." I rose, went, and leaned on my elbows before the panes and watched. In a full electric light, an enormous black mass, quite immovable, was suspended in the midst of the waters. I watched it attentively, seeking to find out the nature of this gigantic cetacean. But a sudden thought crossed my mind. "A vessel," I said, half aloud. "Yes," replied the Canadian, "a disabled ship that has sunk perpendicularly." Ned Land was right. We were close to a vessel of which the tattered shrouds still hung from their chains. The keel seemed to be in good order, and it had been wrecked at most some few hours. 3 stumps of masts, broken off about 2 feet above the bridge, showed that the vessel had to sacrifice its mast. But lying on its side, it had filled, and it was heeling over to port. This skeleton of what it had once been was a sad spectacle as it lay lost under the waves. But sadder still was the sight of the bridge, where some corpses, bound with ropes, were still lying. I counted 5, 4 men, one of whom was standing at the helm, and a woman standing by the poop, holding an infant in her arms. She was quite young. I could distinguish her features, which the water had not decomposed. By the brilliant light from the Nautilus, in one despairing effort, she had raised her infant above her head. Poor little thing, whose arms encircled its mother's neck. The altitude of the 4 sailors was frightful, distorted as they were by the convulsive movements, whilst making a last effort to free themselves from the cords that bound them to the vessel. The steersman alone, calm, with a grave, clear face, his grey hair glued to his forehead, and his hands clutching the wheel of the helm, seemed even then to be guiding the 3 broken masts through the depths of the ocean. What a scene! Sacre bleu! We were dumb. Our hearts beat fast before the shipwreck, taken as it were from life and photographed in its last moments. And I saw already, coming towards it with hungry eyes, enormous sharks, attracted by the human flesh. However, the Nautilus, turning, went round the submerged vessel, and in one instant I read on the stern, "The Florida Sunderland." Chapter 18. Vanikoro. The terrible spectacle was the forerunner of the series of maritime catastrophes that the Nautilus was destined to meet with in its route. As long as it went through more frequented waters, we often saw the hulls of shipwrecked vessels that were rotting in the depths. And deeper down cannons, bullets, anchors, chains, and 1,000 other iron materials eaten by rust. However, on the 11th of December, we sighted the Pomoturu Islands, the old dangerous group of Bougainville that extended over a space of 500 leagues at east-southeast to west-northwest, from the island Ducie to that of Lazarev. This group covers an area of 370 square leagues, and it is formed of 60 groups of islands, among which the Gambier group is remarkable, over which France exercises sway. These are coral islands slowly raised but continuous, created by the daily work of polypi. Then this new island will be joined later on to the neighboring groups, and the fifth continent will stretch from New Zealand and New Caledonia, and from thence to the Marquesas. One day, when I was suggesting this theory to Captain Nemo, he replied coldly, "The Earth does not want new continents, but new men." Side note, 5 paragraphs have been stripped from this edition. On the 15th of December, we left to the east the bewitching group of the Societies and the graceful Tahiti, Queen of the Pacific. I saw in the morning, some miles to the windward, the elevated summits of the island. These waters furnished our table with excellent fish, mackerel, bonitos, and some varieties of sea serpent. On the 25th of December, the Nautilus sailed into the midst of the New Hebrides. Hebrides, a group of about 500 islands off the northwestern coast of Scotland. The inner Hebrides are separated from the outer Hebrides by the Little Minch. On the 25th of December, the Nautilus sailed into the midst of the New Hebrides, discovered by Quiros in 1606, and that Bougainville explored in 1768, and to which Cook gave its present name in 1773. This group is composed principally of 9 large islands that form a band of 120 leagues north by north-south to south-southwest. Between 15 degrees and 2 degrees south latitude and 164 degrees and 168 degrees longitude. We passed tolerably near to the island of Auro, that at noon looked like a mass of green woods surmounted by a peak of great height. That day being Christmas Day, Ned Land seemed to regret sorely the non-celebration of Christmas, the family fete of which Protestants are so fond of. I had not seen Captain Nemo for a week, when on the morning of the 27th he came into the large drawing room, always seeming as if he had seen you 5 minutes before. I was busily tracing the route of the Nautilus on the planisphere. The captain came up to me, put his finger on one spot on the chart, and said this single word: Vanikoro. The effect was magical. It was the name of the island on which La Perouse had been lost. I rose suddenly. "The Nautilus has brought us to Vanikoro?" I asked. "Yes, Professor," said the captain. "And can I visit the celebrated islands where the Beau Sol and the Astrolabe struck?" "If you like, Professor." "When shall we be there?" "We are there now." Followed by Captain Nemo, I went up onto the platform and greedily scanned the horizon. To the northeast, two volcanic islands emerged of unequal size, surrounded by a coral reef that measured 40 miles in circumference. We were close to Vanikoro, really the one to which Dumont d'Urville gave the name of Island de la Recherche, and exactly facing the little harbor of Vano, situated in 16 degrees 4 minutes south latitude and 164 degrees 32 minutes east longitude. The earth seemed covered with verdure from the shore to the summits in the interior that were crowned by Mount Kapagu, 476 feet high. The Nautilus, having passed the outer belt of rocks by a narrow strait, found itself among breakers where the sea was from 30 to 40 fathoms deep. Under the verdant shade of some mangroves, I perceived some savages who appeared greatly surprised at our approach. In the long black body, moving between wind and water, did they not see some formidable cetacean that they regarded with suspicion? Just then, Captain Nemo asked me what I knew about the wreck of La Perouse. "Only what everyone knows, Captain," I replied. "And could you tell me what everyone knows about it?" he inquired ironically. "Easily." I related to him all that the last works of Dumont d'Urville had made known, works from which the following is a brief account. La Perouse and his second, Captain de Langle, were sent by Louis the 16th in 1785 on a voyage of circumnavigation. They embarked in the corvettes Boussole and the Astrolabe, neither of which were again heard of. In 1791, the French government, justly uneasy as to the fate of these two sloops, manned two large merchantmen, the Recherche and the Espérance, which left Brest the 28th of September under the command of Bruni d'Entrecasteaux. 2 months after, they learned from Bowen, commander of the Albermale, that the debris of the shipwrecked vessels had been seen on the coast of New Georgia, but D'Entrecasteaux, ignoring this communication, rather uncertain besides, directed his course towards the Admiralty Islands, mentioned in a report of Captain Hunter's as being the place where La Perouse was wrecked. They sought in vain. The Espérance and the Recherche passed before Vanikoro without stopping there, and in fact this voyage was most disastrous, as it cost D'Entrecasteaux his life, and those of 2 of his lieutenants, besides several of his crew. Captain Dillon, a shrewd old Pacific sailor, was the first to find unmistakable traces of the wrecks. On the 15th of May, 1824, his vessel, the St. Patrick, passed close to Tikopia, one of the new Hebrides. One of the new Hebrides. There a Lascar came alongside in a canoe, sold him the handle of a sword in silver that bore the print of characters engraved on the hilt. The Lascar pretended that 6 years before, during a stay at Vanikoro, he had seen 2 Europeans that belonged to some vessels that had run aground on the reef some years ago. Dillon guessed that he meant La Perouse, whose disappearance had troubled the whole world. He tried to get on to Vanikoro, where, according to the Lascar, he would find numerous debris of the wreck, but winds and tides prevented him. Dillon returned to Calcutta. There he interested the Asiatic Society and the Indian Company in his discovery. A vessel, to which was given the name of the Recherche, was put at his disposal. Recherche was put at his disposal, and he set out 23rd January 1827, accompanied by a French agent. The Recherche, after touching at several points in the Pacific, cast anchor before Vanikoro, 7th July 1827, in that same harbor of Vanuatu, where the Nautilus was at this time. There it collected numerous relics of the wreck, iron utensils, anchors, pulley strops, swivel guns, an 18-pound shot, fragments of astronomical instruments, a piece of crown work, a bronze clock bearing this inscription, Bazin Maffei, the mark of the foundry of the arsenal at Brest about 1785. There could be no further doubt. Dillon, having made all inquiries, stayed in the unlucky place till October. Then he quitted Vanikoro and directed his course towards New Zealand, put into Calcutta 7th April 1828, and returned to France, where he was warmly welcomed by Charles X.
Capital X.
Where he was warmly welcomed by Charles X. But at that time, without knowing Dillon's movements, Dumont d'Urville had already set out to find the scene of the wreck, and they had learned from a whaler that some medals and a cross of St. Louis had been found in the hands of some savages of Louisiade, and New Caledonia. Louisiade and New Caledonia. Dumont d'Urville, commander of the Astrolabe, had then sailed, and 2 months after Dillon had left Vanikoro, he put into Hobart Town. There he learned the results of Dillon's inquiries and found that a certain James Hobbs, second lieutenant of the Union of Calcutta, after landing on the island situated 8 degrees 18 minutes south latitude and 156 degrees 30 minutes east longitude, had seen some iron bars and red stuffs used by the natives of these parts. Dumont d'Urville, much perplexed, and not knowing how to credit the reports of low-class journals, decided to follow Dillon's tracks. On the 10th of February 1828, the Astrolabe appeared off Tikopia and took as guide and interpreter a deserter found on the island, made his way to Vanikoro, sighted it on the 12th inst. Inst meaning present and current date. Lay among the reefs until the 14th, and not until the 20th did he cast anchor within the barrier in the harbor of Vanou. On the 23rd, several officers went round the island and brought back some unimportant trifles. The natives, adopting a system of denials and evasions, refused to take them to the unlucky place. This ambiguous conduct led them to believe that the natives had ill-treated the castaways, and indeed, they seemed to fear that Dumont d'Urville had come to avenge La Pérouse and his unfortunate crew. However, on the 26th, appeased by some presents, and understanding that they had no reprisals to fear, they led Monsieur Jacques to the scene of the wreck. There, in 3 or 4 fathoms of water, between the reefs of Pacou and Vanou, lay anchors, cannons, pigs of lead and iron, embedded in the limy concretions. The large boat and the whaler belonging to the Astrolabe were sent to this place, and not without some difficulty, their crews hauled up an anchor weighing 1,800 pounds, a brass gun, some pigs of iron, and 2 copper swivel guns. Dumont d'Urville, questioning the natives, learned too that La Perouse, after losing both his vessels on the reefs of the island, had constructed a smaller boat, only to be lost a second time, where no one knew. But the French government, fearing that Dumont d'Urville was not acquainted with Dillon's movements, had sent the sloop Bayonnaise, commanded by Le Gorant de Tromelin, to Vanikoro, which had been stationed in the west coast of America. The Bayonnaise cast her anchor before Vanikoro some months after the departure of the astrolabe, but found no new document, but stated that the savages had respected the monument to La Perouse. That is the substance of what I told Captain Nemo. So, he said, no one knows now where the third vessel perished that was constructed by the castaways on the island of Vanikoro. No one knows. Captain Nemo said nothing, but signed to me to follow him into the large saloon. The Nautilus sank several yards below the waves, and the panels were opened. I hastened to the aperture, and under the crustaceans of coral, covered with fungi, I recognized certain debris that the drags had not been able to tear up. Iron stirrups, anchors, cannons, bullets, capstan fittings, the stem of a ship, all objects clearly proving the wreck of some vessel, and now carpeted with living flowers. While I was looking on this desolate scene, Captain Nemo said in a sad voice. Side note, this above paragraph was edited. While I was looking on this desolate scene, Captain Nemo said in a sad voice. Commander La Perouse set out 7th December 1785 with his vessels La Boussole and the Astrolabe. He first cast anchor at Botany Bay, visited the Friendly Isles, New Caledonia, then directed his course towards Santa Cruz and put into Namouka, one of the Hapai group. Then his vessels struck on the unknown reefs of Vanikoro. The Boussole, which went first, ran aground on the southerly coast. The Astrolabe went to its help and ran aground too. The first vessel was destroyed almost immediately. The second, stranded under the wind, resisted some days. The natives made the castaways welcome. They installed themselves in the island and constructed a smaller boat with the debris of the 2 large ones. Some sailors stayed willingly at Vanikoro. The others, weak and ill, set out with La Perouse. They directed their course towards the Solomon Islands, and there perished with everything on the westerly coast of the chief island of the group, between Capes Deception and Satisfaction. How do you know that? By this, that I found on the spot where was the last wreck. Captain Nemo showed me a tin plate box, stamped with the French arms and corroded by the salt water. He opened it, and I saw a bundle of papers, yellow but still readable. They were the instructions of the naval minister to Commander La Perouse, annotated in the margin in Louis XVI's handwriting. Ah, it is a fine death for a sailor, said Captain Nemo at last. A coral tomb makes a quiet grave, and I trust that I and my comrades will find no other.